Hello and welcome to the Armen Show podcast. Science, people, creativity, learning more, authors, professors, scientists, expanding our knowledge and growing as a person. Lifelong learner is in the title that somebody once put together for the program, and that's what we want to support, a lifelong learner. On this episode here, this is a cool one. Someone from where the UK is, currently not in the UK, but joining us we're going to be discussing a bit about anarchy, anarchism, and various facets related to that. I'm Professor Sophie Scott-Brown. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I am glad to have you on. Now, you are a lecturer in philosophy at the University of East Anglia, and also, say it again.
Well, no, I haven't been for a while. I'm a research fellow at St Andrews University in their Institute for Intellectual History.
I saw both of those. I didn't know which one was more fair. Valid. That's cool. How did you get to... Well, before we get to that, you also have a wonderful book, Colin Ward and the Art of Everyday Anarchy, and you have spoken about anarchy multiple times and various times. It's a category of interest that you have represented for. Getting right into it. Why anarchy? Why should people think about it? And why has it spoken to you?
Oh, Armen, just start with an easy one, why don't you? Okay, why anarchy? Well, perhaps I could start with how I got into it because the two elements are very closely entangled. So,
And also, if you could adjust slightly towards the center,
yeah,
that'd be great. Cool.
there we go.
Thank you.
Perfect. Like most people, I think my anarchy was instinctive. So it was a set of feeling and instinct that I then hastily looked around to organize into a philosophy. And from a very early age, I just remember, and perhaps this might be familiar for some of your listeners, just having this sort of kind of healthy disrespect for authority, this skepticism towards it, this questioning, this feeling that all this obedience I was being told from all these different angles, school, television, culture, etc., that obedience is good. And I always felt quite early on just being aware that I don't know why. Why is it good? Are you sure you don't mean convenient? And just really having a strong sense of my own opinion and a strong sense of not agreeing that the world had to be a certain way. So I had all this going on in me, which made it absolutely impossible for me to participate like a regular person in the school system. I found the sort of British public, it's not public education for us. That in Britain, obviously, there's the confusing thing where when we say public, we mean private. The state school system was to me a really quite traumatic experience. I found it so claustrophobic, restrictive. It was literally like kryptonite to me. I would cross over the threshold and I'd go all funny. I wouldn't be able to think properly. I wouldn't be able to communicate properly. And so with all this sort of simmering away, and having this sort of, I should add, incredibly wonderful, understanding parents who were not particularly anarchists or radicals themselves, but were very strong believers that that young people should be taken seriously if they're willing to articulate what their problems were. So, having sort of negotiated my way out of the school system and sort of essentially home educated myself with support of my parents, I kind of ended up stumbling across Canadian author George Woodcock's History of Anarchism in 1962, very dogged penguin paperback in some of my parents' old books. Again, they're not really radicals, but they collected the literature. And this it didn't really convert me as such, but it was exciting for me to discover that there was this whole body of thought dedicated to kind of justifying the way I felt at that moment, and questioning it and imagining how you might organize an entire society based on the complete opposite principle that you generally get in most philosophical textbooks, which is this assumption authority is either necessary or it's good, and therefore we must organize around it. And here's was one going, no, it's crap. Let's think about how we can organize without it. But then what really sort of clicked me over eventually was reading David Graeber's a fragment for an anarchist anthropology in 2004, because what Graeber does in that book is something that the older anarchists didn't do. Instead of saying, this is what the anarchist society is going to look like, he says, do you know what? Why don't you think of anarchism as an attitude, as a way of thinking and acting and practicing that's got no final destination, but is going to shape how you make decisions and how you interact with other people and the kinds of spaces that you want to be putting yourself into. So why do I think anarchy is something we need to be thinking about very seriously right now? Well, frankly, anarchy is your classic quantum philosophy. I know, Armen, that you like science in this program, so I'm going to make a incredibly clumsy metaphoric link here. But
we like metaphors.
It's a quantum philosophy, especially if you take it in Graeber's framework. You know, this idea that it's a way of thinking and it's not resolved and it's not fixed. It's an attitude saying, I want as much liberty from this situation for myself, and in doing so for everybody else, because that's the best way to ensure your own liberty. I want as much of that from this moment as I can possibly get. That mentality is actually much more helpful in dealing with some of the incredibly unique profile of problems that we see today. So if you think modern problems like climate emergency, for example, it's ubiquitous, so it's happening everywhere, but it's really localized and specific. It's also not soluble. You can't have one solution and it's all gone and it's all back to normal. It's going to be an ongoing thing. It's something we live with. Given all that profile, how on earth could you expect to solve this through centralized means? You need as many people and as many brains on the problem as possible. Anarchy is no longer just a luxury or an ideal or a dream. It's actually going to become a practical, intellectual, and political necessity. So that's why we need to think about it.
This is a great way to describe it. A few items come to mind from this. One is the school experience of individuals that might see this potential perspective versus others who would not. They would just go through it and it's fine, no problem. And then there's a small minority that would think, this is not exactly for me. I am feeling limited in some capacity. And that minority doesn't really have too many people to connect with and communicate with at that time. But if you have communicative parents or somebody around at some point, you can link to people and then find a grouping that gets that concept. I like your description that anarchy is more likely to, yeah, that's true. It's more in the present moment. Why is it more likely to return, like in that example of if there are lots of disasters or whatnot, whereas hierarchy doesn't get the job done as well?
Yep, that's a really good summary.
Mm-hmm. I've always never been a fan of hierarchical systems because at each layer there's a percentage that's absorbed away because there's obfuscation or confusion about who goes to what goes to where, and then somebody can extract more than would be normally applicable. Is any form of hierarchy required for society to function?
Okay, yep, that's a good question.
Inherently a bad thing?
Yep, great question. So, anarchy, it's a scary term, and many people, obviously, it carries a lot of cultural baggage, not least because it's had some of the worst PR work done on it ever. So we still, even now, tend to think anarchy, or that sort of either very soppy kind of huggy hippie type people, or it's terrorists. You know, there doesn't seem to be too much in between. But anarchy, actually, if you want to just strip it back to basics, I mean, anarchy, the term literally just means an absence of permanent government. And the key word there for me is permanent, right? So there might be actually, and this is the wonderful thing, again, if you take this slightly more fluid interpretation of it, which is It's a perfectly viable, consistent one with the term, with the concept. And it's this idea that, okay, there might actually be moments when you are trying to deal with a problem and you do actually need someone just to take charge because they know more about it or they're more confident in this situation. The anarchy for me is being able to say, yeah, that's fine. You do that here and now, but you don't do it forever. And that's my problem. I have a problem with permanent forms of authority, because for every time that works out well, there are plenty of times when it fails miserably and causes some of the problems that you just described, Armen. And I think people get caught up still today. I mean, I am constantly approached by people who say to me really kindly, very very sweet, supportive messages like, we really like what you're saying. Oh, but I think I've designed a way that we could do decision making from now on, or I think I've designed how we could organize the economy. And I'm like, this is wonderful. I'm glad you've taken this principle on board. However, the anarchy bit for me is not having a final design. It's giving yourself as many options, as many resources as possible to solve the kind of practical, political, social, economic problems as they arise. So I think you mentioned it earlier. It's about being about doing politics in a way that's incredibly attuned to the moment and the needs and demands of the moment in its fullest sense.
One thing, the moment versus the long term, very interesting. One thing that comes to mind heavily is, let's say there's a hierarchical system that's building. It tends to build more and more. I have a metaphor or example related. Since in the United States, since the 1980s until 2 years ago, obesity has gone up. And for the first time since 1980s, the last 2 years, it's actually slightly dropped, which may be connected with Ozempic, which is an outside, we'll call it pressure or response that's not like about diet and exercise, but something, an external response that has affected it. So maybe it would have kept going up without that. I've noticed that many systems, when they're continuing, it is highly, I'm not sure, but quite unlikely that they alter the path unless something from outside comes in. Could be like the US educational system. Does a hierarchical system keep building forever? Or how can anarchy show up before it goes, let's say, to the end of an empire?
Again, really great question, very interesting, and a couple of things I'd like to say back to that. For a start, the poet, and I don't generally quote poets in political theory discussions, but I'm going to this time. The poet Percy Shelley was fond of kind of talking about, well, he wrote the sonnet Ozymandias, which is basically this idea that all empires fall. You know, and it's a very nice way of putting it. And in some senses, what you're describing is exactly the kind of inbuilt time bomb that most hierarchies have, which actually makes them incredibly useless at responding to problems which don't fit into their existing categories or align with their repertoire of solutions or strategies that they have, which are basically curated and created to keep reproducing themselves first and foremost as their number one priority. In some ways, I mean, it's not just that I find actually the kind of culture around hierarchy and the idea that I'm above you and you're nothing to me. It's not just that I find that morally offensive. I just find the whole thing incredibly intellectually sloppy and inefficient. So that's actually a genuine kind of rejection that I have of it. In terms of this dynamic, I mean, you're quite rightly saying, okay, yeah, you know, you can always make that sort of quasi-Marxian argument, can't you, that, oh, just wait long enough and hierarchy will fall on its ass. But, you know, we've all spotted the fact, well, it might, but it's also got an amazing ability to regenerate in a slightly different form, and that is the reality. So yeah, all empires do fall, but the principle of empire seems to remain quite consistent. It used to be said by figures like Peter Kropotkin, the sort of anarchist thinker of the late 19th century. He used to talk about there being, it's never really a sort of either or situation. Anarchy is never sort of in the wings waiting to come on stage, and we just need to get rid of the hierarchy first, in a kind of way that elements of socialism and Marxism have been a bit more like that. Like once we've got rid of the kind of power structure, then our moment comes and we can get on with the business of being jolly and democratic. And we all know how that story goes. It doesn't. But anarchy is a kind of, actually, and this was something that really came through strongly when I worked on Colin Ward, who I imagine we'll come to at some point. Anarchy is an incredibly kind of perennial, everyday thing. In fact, what we probably don't realize is how much we rely on it, most of us, most of the time, just to get through the day. So many actually of our problems come about through just very spontaneous interactions and arrangements and organization among ourselves. Now, half the time, these can be so mundane, so everyday, arrangements made with friends, negotiating things with, people in kind of, even in at a very kind of mundane level, traffic situations, or even just, the amount of cooperation it takes to walk down a street in New York, for example, like getting out people's way, it's just very tiny little things, which might be insignificant in themselves, but show this enduring capacity we all have, not necessarily to be innately social, but to be cooperative to some degree, even if it's a very limited degree. So anarchy, I think, is a constant presence. What it's not doing is upscaling itself. It's keeping itself very much confined and restrained into sort of very small ways that, like I said, help us get through the day half the time. And the big challenge, I suppose, the really interesting question is, how do we reverse the situation where you've got these sort of this rise and fall of these continual hierarchies, which are failing kind of to solve most of our problems. And as we move towards this very dynamic, complex, uncertain future, is going to become even more unstable. We are seeing that now. Things are degenerating quickly into their most farcical or frightening or basically bellicose, warlike forms. So there's that going on the surface. And in the meantime, our capacity for mutual aid is literally keeping us together by the skin of our teeth. Think about the amount of spontaneous social support networks that came up through the pandemic because there was no other state support available. Think of the food banks. And in Britain, that's become an unbelievably huge problem. And all that immediate response to the people most in need has come simply bubbled up from below. People who don't go around saying, I'm an anarchist. People who just know how to get on and solve problems, which is incidentally what none of us are actually taught to do in school, when most of the time we're taught to think, no, we need to defer that problem to a specialist or an expert. Most of us would love to get more involved in doing things for ourselves. And I speak personally here. I'd actually struggled to know where to start half of the time. My education as even up to this very advanced level that I'm at has not actually equipped me for being a fully participant member of an active democracy. And yet this is supposedly education to participate in a democratic system in a supposedly democratic country. It's failed entirely. So how do we sort of start breaking down the hierarchy and letting more opportunities for anarchy blossom? Well, I think the wonderful thing about anarchy is it also takes us away from traditional notions of revolution. So the idea that you're going to get an anarchist mob together and we're all going to be on message and we're all going to be like, yep, we're ready for some anarchy, and you're going to confront power and you're going to win and then you're going to take over and you're going to get on and organize the anarchist society. No, that's not going to happen. I think the best thing you can do, and I think in some ways it will happen as an inevitable response as power consistently fails to deliver us the things we need. And in some ways it's got to be a bit more organized and structured in order to help itself. But either way, I think what we might see is a sort of a kind of encroachment onto the spaces that power has generally occupied, that we're going to just start having to take back over some space because otherwise those spaces are collapsing around us and our capacity to live in them is massively reduced. So it's an encroachment strategy, I think, is our best bet for finally weakening the fibers of perpetual hierarchy.
How can individuals build their agency throughout their day or week or month so that they're in that mode? I can do things proactively versus, okay, things are handed to me and I accept these layers that are provided. Okay, I'll do that. And these are only the options they gave me because that's what they gave me. Versus I'm a person that causes things and voices things, and I'm an act on the world.
Unbelievably good question. I haven't got a perfect answer for it because, like you said, I still struggle. I mean, you know, I'm always kind of appalled and ashamed at my own lack of knowledge about how the nuts and bolts of basic living gets done. Like, you know, even things like, it sounds, again, I mean, we're so used to thinking of anarchy as this glamorous kind of rebel cause. And actually, a really good anarchist, Colin Maud, used to say that the best anarchist knows about the drain system and how it works, and what happens when there's a problem with it, and knows how to couple your house up to the internet. He didn't say that. It was slightly before his time, but I think he would have if he had. And that's before you get into how you kind of negotiate the cyberspace and make that a more common and accessible space, which of course it is singularly not at the moment. So in terms of, I think the first thing I would say to anybody about, you know, or let's say you're in principle willing to do this. The first and really important thing is you have to just don't there's no need to go too far beyond your own circumstances. In fact, that's the sort of approach to anarchism I think is most resonates for me is that it asks you, look around you right now where you are. Now, don't worry if you're not quite ready to jump out there into the community and set up an entire kind of food bank system, or you're not in the position where you can design a new kind of online common search platform or anything like that. If you can't do that, fine. You have to start from where you're from. And you have to say, well, where in my life can I exercise more decision-making power? Because it's like anything. It's like if you said to me, well, I mean, I used to dance a lot. So if anyone comes to me and says, well, I want to be a dancer, where do I start? And I'm like, well, for goodness sake, don't start by leaping off anything, you know, just you start from where you're at and you do a quick audit of your surroundings and you say, well, where can I? I mean, for example, if you're really keen on you know, sort of media or radio, you know, so it's actually an incredible, there you go, I'm about to turn you into an anarchist. It's an incredible source of sort of rebel energy that rather than just saying, right, well, I'm just going to listen to what the mainstream channels or whatever are putting out there, and saying, well, no, I'm not satisfied by that. It's not telling me the stuff I'm interested in. It's not talking to the people I want to hear from. So you set up your own, and you know, there's this idea in anarchism called appropriate technology, and it's like this idea that a lot of modern tech can be really horrendous for controlling us, especially in the digital sphere, but at the same time it can be really liberating too, and navigating that relationship's hard. But I mean, things like all the platforms we've got for creating our own content, I mean, and that's the other thing about anarchy, right? You don't always have to have special, this is an anarchist thing, because you can actually reclaim certain spaces and sites which are supposedly mainstream, supposedly kind of neoliberal. It depends how you choose to use them. So I think just start by saying, I want to have more say, or even it's simpler than that. I don't think it has to be that way. That's the start. That is the start. Now, okay, that doesn't bring down a government yet, but not going through that process at quite a granular level, and not being quite so confident in yourself that that's how you feel. There's a certain element in anarchism which relies on every single individual and values every single individual having a degree of self-possession, because we do want to come away from those forms of radical politics, which is just all about the herd all the time. And that even if you have doubts or hesitations or skepticism, you have to put it aside for the sake of solidarity. the solidarity that you get in anarchism is much more like, I really respect you and your individuality, even if I'm not going to agree with it. And that I think is quite powerful and quite different from other forms of sort of radical thinking that we're more familiar with.
It makes me think of, if you live a life that way, or if you do little bits of it. I myself, in the example there, am very of this nature for my whole existence. So there's no surprise if I do something of high agency or variety, because I've been doing it forever. But for the person who is enmeshed in a life of, this thing is already calculated and this thing is already there and these people are expecting this and I'm already presented myself this way and I'm nice in this capacity, that person is very entrenched. And for them to do something now, let's say 10 years, 20, 30 years later, that is out of the bounds, is like a huge thing. There's, wait a minute, but you've presented yourself this way the whole time. We thought you were part of the herd, and now you have like a thought. Where did this thought come from? Like, you must have had it before. Were you lying before? There's like a weight to it. And can you speak on the qualities of a person? What are the qualities of a person who had that from a very young age and kept it going? And did Colin Ward have some of these qualities from an early age?
So for a start, I mean, I think in America too, I mean, I'm sort of one of the areas I work on mid-century intellectual history. And obviously looming over the kind of post-war American moment is sort of David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd and William White, Organization Man, describing how in America there is actually, ironically, there's this incredibly strong reputational history for individualism, and yet almost as equally strong history of kind of conformity and conformism, and how the kind of how incredibly molecular those forces are when sort of in trying to kind of shape and frame how people grow up, how they act, how they think, what they feel is good, and what they feel is bad. So it's, you know, in no way am I trying to kind of downplay or underestimate the unbelievable force that people feel everywhere. I'm sort of focusing on America because I happen to be here, but it's ubiquitous, right? You know, every government is gonna leave a force in different ways. The most blatant are, of course, the army and the police, but then, you know, it's actually maybe the soft power, the psychology, the education, the values, the kind of all those sort of elements. They're unbelievably powerful. So at the same time, like I said, nobody's ever 100% on message. I mean, this was the other major thing that came out of the sort of mid-century period, 1950s, absolutely obsessed with psychology and propaganda and you know, community, how you sort of develop communities in one way rather than another, how you prevent radicalization, which tended to mean how you prevented anyone thinking differently from you in a kind of governmental context. And the big take-home message is, it never quite works. People are actually extraordinarily kind of awkward or contrary like that. And I mean, like I said, it's sort of, if you have been that person under that enormous power, under enormous weight and stress to conform, I mean, in some ways, a lot of the anarchist arguments was, well, it comes out somewhere, and actually, you know, and it can come out sometimes in very destructive behaviors if you spend all your time towing the line and actually quite consciously being aware that you're suppressing other instincts or other parts of yourself in order to align. You know, that's probably heading to either a very intense personal mental health crisis type situation, or worse, some sort of incredibly antisocial behavior in some form or another. That's not to dismiss all forms of crime or bad behavior as just repressed desire, which some anarchists have been tempted to do. No, I think it's more complicated than that, but nevertheless, there's something in that. So I'm going to be very optimistic here and says I don't think you ever get the perfect organization, Mom. I think everyone's got something somewhere where they're just more quietly conscious of not quite agreeing. And in some ways, we're seeing this in quite a kind of strange, semi-destructive way on the political scene right now. People who, for a long time have been towing a particular line about how things should be, how life should be, what's good, what's not, and actually having these sort of feelings that are quite contrary to that, and sort of feeling they can't enter the public space. I can't speak that feeling aloud, And now a lot of sort of demagogue type figures are emerging to say, actually give license to that and say, well, do you know what? It's okay not to like these values, or it's okay not to. And, that is a difficult, I find this difficult because on the one hand, I completely understand and respect why people may want to hold non-conformist views. On the other, it's incredibly difficult to have to accept that a lot of those views are very challenging and against what I would naturally feel. And I don't necessarily think we have to reduce this to a their way or our way. I think we do have to recognize that actually that's what a proper radical democracy is. Incidentally, demagoguery is democracy without responsibility. So I do feel that the situation would change very quickly if people who are not happy with the way things are right now were actually told, do you know what would you do instead? Don't worry about just batting back and forward. This is right, this is wrong. Change the question. What would you do instead? How would you organize our complex social life if you have more power and ability to? I think that will produce some quite different results from the back and forth, the Punch and Judy show that politics is fast becoming. Now, in terms of Colin Ward, it's interesting you mentioned that. The biggest, most extraordinary thing about Colin Ward was that he was completely not extraordinary, and he made an absolute virtue of it. He made an absolute thing of being a very ordinary person. What he meant by ordinary was that he didn't aspire to be a political or intellectual or a social or cultural leader. He wanted, of course he was, so in some ways it was a bit of a performance, but he wanted to show people that you didn't need to have particular aspirations or live a special kind of life or eat a special kind of food or whatever it may be. Anybody could find in themselves the ability to problem solve without reference to a higher authority. That's it. That's all he was asking anyone to start with. So I think that's quite a liberating message, because I personally have, I'll confess now, I'm a bit reluctant when it comes to sort of belonging to a club or going to a movement or sort of being part of a collective. I actually genuinely just like a lot of the time just thinking my own thoughts and doing my own thing. And what Colin said was, well, that doesn't actually discount you from being potentially a very radical person and potentially a very social person. Because if you take that view out into the world and you make sure that you recognize that everybody else has got the right to feel that way too, then actually it puts you into quite a creative space. In some ways, this kind of democracy, this kind of anarchy dovetails very closely with a sort of radical account of democracy. It's this idea that we don't all have to have our perfect little worlds all figured out. We just have to have a strong sense that we have a right, well, not even a right, but that we should be part of shaping what it means to live together. And that process isn't ever going to be finished, it's ongoing. So that makes, I think, anarchy a lot more accessible. And it means that even that person that's towed the line, and you know what, that's not always a bad thing. There's a lot of really good qualities. If you're someone who thinks it's just important to be a good team player, oh my goodness, that's valuable. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's only wrong when you kind of are overriding every other instinct in yourself in order to achieve that. So I think this Colin Ward's kind of anarchy is one that makes space for everyone to enter into it kind of in their own space and in their own way.
I see a theme here where we're not a fan of the part where, like, when a hierarchy builds and then there's percentages of loss or someone extracts for themselves in the confusion and obfuscation. Same thing with people when they get comfortable. Oh, I'm part of this group. Maybe it was good intention at the beginning, and then 1 month, 5 months down the line, now they're in a comfortable grouping, but they're cutting away at parts of themselves that they would have showcased normally. There's a loss there, and we don't want that loss, because it's like it's like a death while alive. That's the way I would describe it. It's like you're not there at that moment. So there's a bit of that. We don't want that element. I like that you brought up responsibility. That's a big one, because I see so many debates happen, and then it could be with college students in a person or talks online. There's so many, and then when it comes to making a point, if you actually said, okay, what would you like to do about that? Now the responsibility and accountability is on you. 80%, a large percentage of the time, the person that was very punchy is now quiet and doesn't have their solution or the thing they would do. The whole point was, whatever you're doing, I will jab at it, but my actual plan for it, not there. How do we increase the level of responsibility and accountability that people take, or is that not as common among our fellow people?
Well, I mean, I think you're completely right. It's quite often how quickly different kinds of people come to the fore when you just switch the question from what's wrong with this idea, or why is that person wrong and you're right, and you switch it to, okay, well, what could we do instead? And it's really interesting, actually. A lot of people who normally sit there very quietly are actually some of your richest conformists, because they've got actually quite high social intelligence, are the ones which immediately start thinking in terms of that, well, how can we reconfigure this situation? There is always room for those gobby types that won't shut up and happily tell you everything that's wrong with your world. I mean, they're very important, actually. I mean, what they do is continually punch holes in power. So, and that's, there's always a double two-prongedness to the way I think about anarchism. On the one hand, anarchism's got to be this constant attack on power in all its forms, which can actually feel quite self-defeating, because quite often it attacks itself. As often as it attacks anyone else. But it's got to be a continual questioning, so you never become enclosed in any system of thought. It's constantly, the door's open. It's not perfect. There's other things we could do. There's other ways we could think. Wonderful. But you also do need that current of constructive thinking where it says, right, well, if the ball's in my hands now, how am I going to play it? And again, I think one of the reasons anarchism feels so, even when I phrase it in this kind of way, which is actually just, I mean, you could just reframe this as, we need to do social intelligence better. We need to know how to be in groups together without having to just reduce that always to rules. And actually a very rich line of inquiry that a lot of anarchists have been interested in is the study of group dynamics, I mean, it's no coincidence someone like David Graeber comes from anthropology, which is fundamentally interested in how human beings interact. You've always got to resist, however, whenever you sort of tamper with the sciences as an anarchist, you've got to resist sort of trying to come out and say, well, science proves that we should all be anarchists. No, it doesn't. Science says we could all do things this way. No, it doesn't. Science will tell you if a particular hypothesis is true or false, right? That's it. So that said, you can draw an awful lot from just actually, the other thing science asks you to do is pause and reflect and be a bit more precise about what you're asking and how you're assessing it. And yeah, so a lot of what I talk about when I talk about anarchism is actually just rediscovering the fun and the pleasure of what it is to be in a group without feeling that you have to assimilate in a way that destroys certain parts of you, as you were describing. But that doesn't mean that you're just totally exposed all of the time. There is a degree to which you edit yourself in any interaction. What it keeps coming down to is the extent to which you're comfortable with that, the extent to which you still feel that you can be an agent in that group, that you're not just playing a role beyond, that you have a strong emotional connection to being in that space and a degree of control over what you're doing. So one of the metaphors I like to use, again, like I said, I have this sort of dance theatre background, and I quite enjoy saying to people, well, think of it a bit like this. If you've ever seen improv theatre in action, right, that to me is quite another good useful metaphor for thinking about the kind of anarchy I'm describing. When you have a sort of improv situation, nobody possesses that situation because you're kind of co-creating it as you go along. And so nobody's in control of it, and yet nobody's fully controlled by it. Like, everyone in that space could change the action at a given second. So it's sort of incredibly innately democratic. And it's also it's a low stakes. It's not a scary situation. What it does, I mean, something like theatre, what it does wonderfully is it upturns the usual flow of things. So in a usual social situation, we've kind of become conditioned to be really frightened of disagreeing with each other and see conflict as this perennially bad thing. If you're in a devised drama or an improv situation, conflict's really exciting because it's drama. It's, you know, it's something you can play off. It's something you can spin with. If you have plays where you all just sat around going, oh, yes, Mary Jane, I perfectly agree. You know, it will be boring for you as the actor, let alone the poor gits that have to watch you. So I think, again, to me, it just keeps coming back to this idea of, well, you know, we've actually forgotten how to enjoy each other and enjoy how weird and wonderful we are, and to not worry if we don't agree with each other all the time. Of course, sometimes conflict will not be creative. It will just be conflict, in which case actually there's enough people in the world where you can you don't have to become. The other thing that's happening is we're getting very reliant on being in particular groups all the time. The nature of modern industrial or the globalized world that we live in now is that actually we belong to many different tribes, many different communities simultaneously, and that when we talk about being individual, I suppose what the anarchists would say is, well, most individuals, what we really mean is we're multi-social beings. Our individuality comes from the fact that we can be participants in lots of different groups simultaneously, and we can take bits from those groups and mix and match them, and therefore regenerate all the different spaces that we enter into. And the big problem I think we've got at the moment is that we're really being hedged into particular groups, racial groups, gendered groups, national groups, you know, and we're not being allowed to give expression to the full range of social relationships that any one person living in the kind of world that we live in today is actually kind of naturally participant in.
Solid points here. When I think about the grouping phenomenon, we as people, where do we want to be? Who do we want to be around if we have this kind of mindset? Because let's say I share a lot of the views that you're describing. So, but then if I was around you a lot, I would be comfortable. And then if I was with individuals that I didn't mesh with in many ways, or I saw low agency or lack of variety or ambiguity handling or things like that, then I would not be comfortable. So that part's a good portion, I guess, that I'm not comfortable. But now a lot of my points are being missed. Maybe I'm not getting through. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere. Where does the person go if they are... Who are the right people for, let's say, an anarchist type to connect with in their life?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to be contrary and say that actually the best anarchist training is actually going in there kind of curious about anyone and everyone. Now, you're quite right. Not everyone's going to be sort of naturally like, you know, just not going to sort of, there's going to be no energy flow between you and some people in the world. That is just life. But I suppose it's training a kind of mental space where there's just that excitement and curiosity about people again, which I think we've really lost. I think we are increasingly now, I mean, even in what you're describing, there's that fearfulness, right? And I think that's become so encultured, particularly, you know, I think it does come incredibly through the very strong, insidious neoliberalism that we live within, which says, you know, even in a school or an education context, right? They're not your peers. they're your competitors. You know, I mean, so that's why I'm saying education in America, in the UK, in Western Europe, in Australia, you know, places like that, you know, these great democratic nations, it's not democratic education. How is it when we're trained to be competitors all the time? And so there's always this, therefore, this note of fearfulness. What if I don't like this person? That's fine. But you might still get something from them. I suppose it's just that, to me, there's a wonderful kind of cheeky opportunism in anarchism, which is like, again, that idea that you go into any situation saying, how much liberty can I get out of this is quite exciting for me. How much can I get out of this person? You know, this idea that anyone might have something which, you know, kind of might spark with you in some way, even if overall you don't connect with them. Now, so I think in general, I'd say that the kind of anarchy as a mind space is just go out there and see what you can get from any situation. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and you don't need to worry about that. But it's also about unlearning some of the fearfulness, and sort of questioning, well, where does that come from? Why am I always worried about whether I'm going to fit in or whether you're going to reject me or exclude me? I mean, there's like billions of people in the world, you know, sort of if one seed doesn't flower, then another one is going to. So, you know, there is, and, you know, but again, that cultural pressure that if this doesn't work, if this becomes a failure or I become a failure, it's incredibly socially inhibiting. And so much of the work of adopting an anarchist mindset for this generation, for our generation, is actually basically a job of just unpicking all this fearfulness and anxiety that you know, it's not even private anymore. It is an absolute, it's a pandemic in its own right. Every other person is, you know, sort of suffering really acute kind of senses of distress, depression, anxiety, whatever form it takes. You know, there are obviously huge variations of intensity that comes at, and I'm certainly not diminishing anyone's experience, but right now we literally do live in an age of anxiety, in the sense that what we're facing is anxiety inducing, and the way we are raised, the institutions we are dragged through, exacerbate, if they don't create, they certainly exacerbate anxiety. So anarchy can be almost therapeutic in that sense. If you just sort of say, right, well, I'm going to flip the narrative on this, and I'm going to say I'm not frightened anymore. Like, even if I don't like this person, even if they don't accept me, you know, it's that's okay, because I'll take something from this. I'll take what they least expect. So there is that element. However, there is also the political element. So it's all very nice thinking, right, well, anarchy can be a bit of therapy and we can all think differently, and maybe indirectly, somehow, not quite sure how, but eventually, if enough of us are feeling this way, we'll kind of just crowd out the baddies. No. Unfortunately, we say in the UK, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Power doesn't neatly, you know, pack itself away without a fight. So there is a degree to which we do need to think about, well, what kinds of political formations and groupings can we form that satisfy our objective of challenging, making a genuine and authentic challenge to power in some form or another, without losing all that other wonderful, creative, explorative, individualistic side of it. I suppose in my research, I haven't solved this problem, by the way. So if you're hanging on here waiting for the, ooh, and it goes like this, sorry, haven't got to that bit yet. In my research, I call it sort of basically, the problem is, can radical democratic means produce radical democratic ends? And very possibly they can, but I think, you know, again, it's about having to allow ourselves, forgive ourselves. The traditional ways of thinking how you should do politics is this confrontation, the unity of one group against the unified other group in a clash, etc. And genuinely saying, right, well, we have seen some incredible examples in, you know, activist history, things like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the climate protests, and people always sort of, you know, they sort of feel that they ought to do more, that ought to trigger, that ought to have triggered the whole revolution. But actually, if you look at the pace that they're coming at every few years, I mean, it's a longue durée argument. Revolutions take time to do properly, and actually more people than ever have been politically active, and there's the sort of levels of organization activism are more sophisticated now. You no longer have to be a fully paid up communist who believes that, who believes in a totalized world order. You can actually strike hard and fast and significantly by saying, right, well, I'm not going to commit you my whole soul, but I'm going to be completely behind you on this issue. I'm going to say, no, I object to the 99% without having to then sign up to a full alternative program. Or I object to the racist murder of black people. Or I object to the genocide taking place in Palestine right now, without then having to commit to a worldview. And I think actually there's really interesting areas in thinking more carefully about how that kind of activism over a kind of cascade system, endlessly kind of challenge, can start weakening some of the deeper fabric and structure of power.
Strong point. Who are some individuals who have guided your philosophy, or is there anybody that was a fork in the road for your path? Any key players that come to mind?
Well, Colin, obviously, going to get a plump in for Colin Ward. He was really interesting to work on. His big thing was that he wasn't particularly an original anarchist thinker. All these ideas, all this notion about anarchy as a state of mind and a way of practice, they were all in the movement. But what he did brilliantly was to make them accessible to ordinary people. So his book, Anarchy in Action, for example, remains one of the clearest, most accessible and engaging statements of what anarchy is, without a single bomb in sight. Although his publishers did scupper his plans by sticking a picture of a riot on the original 1972-3 front cover, which just goes to show publishers can ruin your best laid plans, occasionally. So there was Colin. And then, like I said, there was David Graeber for me. He was very important. I don't necessarily uphold his position entirely, but I think, again, that really interesting notion of anarchy as actually an approach to human relations, which he does obviously through emphasizing anthropology. And then the other thing, I think he was brilliantly interesting about what was going on in Occupy with his direct action and ethnography, and this idea that Occupy got criticized so much for not having a beautifully finalized version of how the world should be, but being incredibly, in some ways, very spontaneous. Just a lot of people going, well, we can all get on board with the idea that we are the 99 and we oppose the 1% sort of thing. Very powerful idea. But without then having to say exactly what a new world should look like. But the interesting thing that he shows in that is that through their arguments and what was happening within particular Occupy camps is there was lots of rehearsals for different types of democracy, which is actually, it is the kind of world that people wanted, but it's not that traditional prefigurative politics as in this is how we do things and this is how it could work everywhere. It was literally like, well, what would it be if everyone arguing was our way of life? So I think that was really powerful and inspiring for me. Just having David kind of show me Occupy in that light made it very meaningful and very interesting to me. And then I'm really I think that there's some really interesting work being done by people like Wendy Brown, kind of very challenging stuff. Donna Caraway obviously has always been, these are sort of my kind of academic touchstones, especially because they bring in that strong female voice as well, which can sometimes be eclipsed from a lot of the kind of normative theory kind of material. So that's important. But actually, and this is genuinely true, when you sort of settle in your mind that you're going to look at things in that way, and just I'm actually incredibly amazed and astonished by just people, like just everyday people. Like I actually feel incredibly humbled by how capable so many people are. People who wouldn't badge themselves anarchists, write a book on it, go on the radio on it or anything like that, but it's just um it's just quite encouraging for me, just in the absolute run of everyday life, how many people are actually incredibly good at just reaching out, connecting, problem solving, just on the fly, without ever really patting themselves on the back for it and thinking they're doing anything special. That's pretty inspiring to me.
That makes sense. That is a humble crew in some ways as well, the way they may go about things. That's a cool feature. I like quite a few of the elements you bring up. I resonate with some of the most important parts of my existence were where I said something, tried something, did something, because they're like a you stamped at that moment in time, and that can only be if you represented yourself in some way. Could be publicly, could even be to yourself in your journal, but you know that you stepped a little bit outside of your regular, or you said something that spoke to you. So that is substantial, and it brings a lot of self-esteem and inspires more. I think that's a cool feature that comes from it. My last question to you would be, if you had a message, I always like this, if you had a megaphone and you had a message about what the concept of anarchy could bring to people to their day-to-day, or what they might want to take away from it for their being, what might you tell the general populace?
I think if I had the megaphone, I'd obviously have to try and keep it, slick, pithy. Otherwise they'd stop listening, with me sort of screeching at them. But I think what I'd like to kind of say is that um, I pose a question to people, just uh, what might the world look like if you didn't have, what might the world look like without constant reference to authority? So how might you live if it was up to you? How might you live with others if it was up to you? Because I think for me, if there's anything really important I can do, it's to help come away from this notion. Yeah, anarchy is a theory of social organization without permanent authority. But what I feel is that never just reduces down to a blueprint for horizontal organization, right? Because that's communism. We've got that. We know that there's a difference between horizontal social organization and freedom. The feeling of freedom, when people feel free, and it's not necessarily free because they can do what they want when they want, or they can get what they want when they want. That's a very insecure form of freedom, because it's tenuous. It lasts for as long as those choices are made available to you in the outside world. Real freedom is, I think, what we've been talking about, where you don't worry about what's going to happen in any social interaction, because you feel it's okay. Even if it goes badly, I'll be fine. I'll get something from it. I'll move on. It won't be the end of the world. That's a lot more liberating. So the other thing, maybe if I get 2 shots of the megaphone, is, maybe I shout something like, don't worry about other people, be curious about them instead, or something maybe a little bit more polished, but something along those lines. Be curious about other people. What's the worst that could happen? Well, actually, in New York, be curious carefully about other people.
That's funny. Right. Both quite strong and somewhat, I don't say it often, but yeah, they're inspiring natured messages, which speaks to me in that capacity. Good to think about as an individual, and what a cool category to. It's a big part. It's some percentage of my being, so I resonate with the description. Professor Sophie Scott-Brown, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode and bringing us quite a bit of knowledge about anarchy, your teaching, Colin Ward, and relation to people and what people can take away from anarchy in general.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful to have you on. And we are out.